What if your wedding night was a public spectacle? What if your neighbors played loud, annoying pranks outside your bedroom window for days? What if tears were a required part of your big day? Across Europe, from roughly the 5th to the 15th centuries, medieval weddings were wild, public, and sometimes deeply strange events, far removed from the quiet ceremonies we know today. Number 7. The grand and chaotic feast. The air in the great hall often hummed with the excited chatter of 100 voices, sometimes more, sometimes less, depending on the social standing of the families involved in the union. Long tables, often constructed from simple planks laid upon trestles, stretched across the room, groaning under the weight of the feast. It was a spectacle of abundance, a display of wealth and status that served as a cornerstone of medieval wedding celebrations. Before the food was even brought in, the hall would be adorned with banners and tapestries, the family crests displayed prominently. Fresh rushes often covered the floor, emitting a faint, earthy scent, sometimes mixed with sweet-smelling herbs. The hall was a place of communal joy, but also of a certain wildness that might surprise modern sensibilities. The procession of the food itself was an event. Servants, often dressed in simple tunics, carried immense platters from the kitchens, their movements precise and practiced, despite the great weight they bore. Roasted meats were central to the feast. Entire boars, oxen, or deer, sometimes dressed in their own skins or adorned with feathers, made a grand entrance. The roasted animals, still steaming, were carved directly at the table by skilled carvers, often senior members of the household, using long, sharp knives. Thick slices of meat, dripping with juices, were then distributed to the guests. Alongside the roasted beasts, there would be poultry, chickens, geese, ducks, and sometimes swans or peacocks, their plumage carefully reassembled for visual effect. These birds would be presented on large wooden boards or metal trays, their golden brown skins glistening under the flickering light of tallow candles and torches. Fish, especially during fasting seasons or for those living near rivers or the coast, formed another significant part of the meal. Freshly caught salmon, trout, or pike, often poached or fried, were served with various sauces. Puddings made from grains, eggs, and spices, sometimes sweetened with honey or dried fruit, were common accompaniments. Vegetable dishes, while present, were often less prominent than the meat. Boiled cabbage, carrots, or peas might appear, but they were not the stars of the show. Spices, a luxury from far-off lands, were used liberally. Pepper, ginger, cinnamon, cloves, and nutmeg flavored many dishes, a clear sign of the host's affluence. Salsas, often thick and savory, made from ground nuts, breadcrumbs, and various herbs, were poured generously over the meats. Drinking was as central to the feast as eating. Large wooden tankards of ale and cider were refilled constantly by diligent servants moving among the tables. Wine, for those who could afford it, flowed freely from large jugs or barrels, often served in small metal or wooden cups. Quality of the drink varied, from cloudy, locally brewed ale to more refined wines imported from France or the Rhineland. Toasts were frequent, often initiated by the groom's family or the most senior guests. A loud clamor would accompany each toast as tankards were raised and then clunked back onto the wooden tables. Entertainment was an integral part of the grand feast. Minstrels and musicians, playing lutes, harps, pipes, and drums, provided a continuous soundtrack of lively tunes and ballads. Their music was often loud enough to be heard over the din of conversations and clanking cutlery. Jesters, with their brightly colored garments and bells, moved among the guests, telling jokes, performing simple tricks, or mimicking the actions of the more esteemed attendees, eliciting bursts of laughter. Tumblers and acrobats might also perform, their agile movements adding to the visual spectacle. Storytellers with their dramatic voices recounted tales of chivalry, romance, or ancient heroes, sometimes pausing to allow for hearty applause or communal groans. The seating arrangements were often hierarchical. The bride and groom, along with their immediate families and the most important guests, sat at a high table, usually elevated on a dais, giving them a clear view of the entire hall and making them visible to all. Lesser guests occupied the long tables, stretching perpendicular from the high table. The noise level was immense. People spoke loudly to be heard. Laughter erupted frequently, and the clatter of dishes and cutlery mingled with the music and entertainment. Formal etiquette, as we understand it today, was often loose. Guests might eat with their hands, using knives to cut their meat and broad slices of stale bread, known as trenchers, to soak up juices. Trenchers were often discarded afterwards, sometimes given to the poor. The duration of the feast varied. It could last for several hours, stretching well into the evening, or even for several days. Particularly in noble households, guests would drift in and out, some retiring for naps and returning for more food and drink. The feast was a marathon of consumption, a test of endurance for both hosts and guests. The sheer quantity of food and drink was meant to impress, to solidify alliances between families, and to project an image of prosperity and generosity. The wedding feast was not just a meal. It was a carefully orchestrated social event, a public affirmation of the new marital bond, and a testament to the family's standing within the community. The waste generated was often considerable, with vast amounts of food scraps and bones destined for the dogs or the poor. Towards the end of the feast, some guests might become boisterous, their voices growing louder, their laughter more uninhibited. It was a time of joyous abandon, reflecting the public and often unrestrained nature of medieval celebrations. The aroma of roasted meat, stale ale, and human perspiration mingled in the crowded hall, creating a distinct, powerful scent that lingered long after the last guest departed. The light, initially bright from the midday sun streaming through narrow windows, would gradually dim, giving way to the softer, warmer glow of numerous candles and torches, casting dancing shadows on the walls and highlighting the animated faces of the revelers. Number 6. The noisy serenade of the charivari. The night was often pierced by a cacophony of sound, shattering the usual quiet of the medieval village or town. This was the charivari, a boisterous and often unruly procession that would descend upon the home of newlyweds, particularly those whose marriage was seen as unconventional or socially inappropriate. The participants, often young men but sometimes involving a wider cross-section of the community, gathered with an assortment of makeshift instruments. There were no harmonious melodies here, only a deliberate, jarring noise designed to disrupt the peace and draw attention. The instruments of a charivari were rarely musical in the traditional sense. Instead, they were everyday objects, repurposed for noise-making. Pots and pans, lifted from kitchen hearths, were beaten with wooden spoons or sticks, producing a loud metallic clang. Cowbells, typically used to locate livestock, were rung furiously, their dull clunks adding to the din. Horns, often made from animal horns or even rudimentary brass, were blown with gusto, emitting deep, resonant blasts that carried far across the fields. Whistles of various pitches and sizes shrieked through the night air. Drums, sometimes fashioned from stretched animal skins over wooden frames, provided a rhythmic pounding foundation to the otherwise chaotic soundscape. In some regions, even old wagon wheels, dragged over cobbled streets, added a grating, scraping sound. Collective effect was an overwhelming wall of sound, designed to penetrate walls and disturb the sleep of anyone within earshot. The charivari was not a fleeting moment of noise. It often lasted for hours, sometimes even for several consecutive nights, particularly if the participants felt their message was not being received or if their demands were not met. Procession would march slowly through the village streets, drawing a growing crowd of curious onlookers from their homes. Participants would circle the house of the newlyweds, their voices raised in crude chants and mocking songs, often improvising verses that alluded to the perceived impropriety of the marriage. These songs were seldom polite. They often contained bawdy references or pointed criticisms of the couple's age difference, previous marital history, or perceived moral failings. The words, shouted in unison, were meant to embarrass and shame. The clothing worn by the charivari participants was often as unconventional as their music. Many wore disguises, masks made from cloth or animal skins, or even smeared their faces with soot to avoid immediate identification. Some donned animal costumes, particularly those representing unruly beasts like bears or wolves, adding to the spectacle's wild and untamed atmosphere. These disguises blurred social distinctions and encouraged bolder behavior, allowing individuals to participate in actions they might otherwise shy away from. Torches, carried aloft, cast flickering light and dancing shadows illuminating the grotesque masks and animated faces of the participants, making the scene even more dramatic and unsettling for the target couple. The purpose of the charivari, while not stated by the article, was expressed through its actions. It served as a powerful form of social control. It was a means by which the community expressed its disapproval of a marriage that violated local customs or perceived moral norms. For instance, a marriage between an elderly widow and a young man, or a couple where one party was known for illicit behavior, might trigger a charivari. The noise was a public shaming, a clear signal that the community was watching and judging. In some instances, the charivari could also be used to extract a payment from the newlyweds, a kind of fine for their perceived transgression. The noise would cease only when the couple either paid a sum of money or provided drinks to the participants, a form of negotiated truce. This was a direct public demand enforced through the persistence of the unbearable noise. The repeated nature of the event was key. If the newlyweds ignored the first night of noise, the charivari would return, often with greater numbers and louder intensity, night after night, until the community's message was undeniably delivered or their demands were satisfied. The sounds would penetrate the thickest walls, making sleep impossible and turning the couple's first nights of marriage into a torturous ordeal. Neighbors might watch from their windows, some silently approving, others perhaps feeling pity, but few daring to intervene directly against the communal will. The charivari was a powerful reminder of the collective authority of the village or town, a demonstration that individual actions were always subject to communal oversight and judgment. Participants moved with a unified purpose, their steps often heavy and deliberate as they circled the targeted dwelling. The echoes of their shouts and instruments would reverberate off the stone and timber structures, amplifying the sense of pervasive noise. It was a complete sensory assault, leaving little room for escape or denial of the community's disapproval. Number 5. The expected tears of the bride. A medieval bride, on her wedding day, was often expected to shed tears. This was not merely an emotional outburst, but a public demonstration, almost a performance, observed by her family, her future husband, and the wider community. The absence of tears might even be viewed with suspicion, suggesting a lack of proper sentiment or a too eager departure from her maiden life. The expectation of sorrow was deeply ingrained in the customs surrounding the transition from one state of life to another. The pressure on the bride to weep began even before the ceremony. As she prepared to leave her childhood home, surrounded by her mother's sisters and female attendants, an atmosphere of bittersweet farewell would permeate the chambers. Female relatives would offer comforting words, yet their gestures and expressions often encouraged the release of emotion. They might gently touch her face or hold her hands, their own eyes perhaps moist, creating a shared emotional space where tears were a natural and anticipated response. The rustle of her finest gown, perhaps made of silk or finely woven wool, would accompany her as she made her way from her private rooms. The specific moments when tears were most anticipated included her final farewell to her family. As she embraced her parents, particularly her mother, a trembling lip and welling eyes were considered appropriate. It signified her sorrow at leaving the familiar comfort and protection of her paternal household, acknowledging the significant shift in her life's trajectory. Her eyes, perhaps red-rimmed, would dart around the familiar surroundings, taking in every detail before her departure. The slight tremor in her voice as she spoke her goodbyes was also noted by those around her. During the wedding procession to the church, or upon entering the sacred space, further opportunities for tears arose. The solemnity of the church, the weight of the vows she was about to make, and the public scrutiny could all contribute to an emotional display. The slight downturn of her mouth, the careful dabbing at the corner of her eyes with a small, often embroidered handkerchief, were observable actions. Sometimes, a gentle sigh or a soft, almost inaudible sniffle would escape her. These were not hidden acts. They were seen, noted, and often approved of by the onlookers. In some parts of Europe, and particularly within certain social strata, there were even accounts of crying women or professional mourners being employed to facilitate or amplify the emotional display. These women, skilled in inducing tears, would accompany the bride, sometimes murmuring sympathetic words or even initiating a low lament, thereby encouraging the bride to join in. Their presence ensured that the required atmosphere of sorrowful farewell was present, providing a backdrop against which the bride's own tears could be seen as genuine and sufficient. These women might use their own handkerchiefs, ostentatiously wiping their eyes, or letting out audible sobs to create the desired effect. Their voices, often hushed and mournful, would blend into a somber chorus, adding to the gravitas of the occasion. The public observation of the bride's emotional state was crucial. Guests and onlookers would discreetly, or sometimes openly, assess whether she cried enough, whether her sorrow seemed genuine. A dry-eyed bride might be seen as cold, unfeeling, or perhaps too eager to abandon her family, which could be interpreted as a negative reflection on her character or on her new union. The subtle nods of approval from older female relatives, or the hushed comments exchanged among the female guests, indicated that the bride's emotional expression was being carefully evaluated. Her face, often pale with emotion or the exertion of the day, would be closely scrutinized for any sign of a tear. The specific gestures of comfort from family or friends, too, played a part in this public display. A mother might gently caress her daughter's cheek, wiping away a tear with her thumb. A sister might put a reassuring arm around her, offering a quiet murmur of solace. These acts of comfort further emphasized the bride's vulnerability and the significance of her tears. The sound of quiet weeping, distinct from the boisterous laughter of the feast, was a temporary but important part of the wedding day's soundscape, a counterpoint to the later celebrations. The flickering light from the candles in the church, or the natural daylight filtering through the windows, would highlight the glistening tracks on her cheeks as the tears flowed. The heavy fabric of her dress might feel oppressive against her skin, adding to a sense of solemnity that contributed to her emotional state. The silence in the chamber, save for the quiet sounds of preparation and hushed voices, allowed any sniffle or sob to be clearly heard. This public expectation and the subsequent observation of the bride's tears was a deeply ingrained aspect of medieval wedding custom, a visible representation of her transition and the profound shifts in her life. Number 4. The ransom of the bridal shoe. Amidst the joyous clamor of the wedding feast, a particular mischievous custom often unfolded: the stealing of the bride's shoe. This was a playful, yet structured disruption, designed to inject a moment of light-hearted chaos and negotiation into the festivities. It was a well-known game, anticipated by many, especially the younger attendees, and its execution often involved the groom in a comical quest. The act of theft was typically carried out by the groomsmen, or sometimes by younger, more daring boys from the community. The moment chosen for the heist was usually when the bride was seated, perhaps resting from the day's events, or distracted by conversation or the ongoing entertainment. With a swift, surreptitious movement, one of her shoes would be whisked away from beneath the table, or discreetly removed from her foot while she was engaged. The shoe itself, often made of fine leather or embroidered fabric, would be a symbol of the bride's beauty and new status, making its temporary disappearance all the more noticeable. Its absence would create a small stir, a murmur of amusement spreading through the nearby guests. Once the shoe was successfully purloined, the thief would often make a show of it, holding it aloft for all to see or hiding it conspicuously. A playful chase might ensue, with the bride or her attendants feigning outrage in attempting to retrieve it. However, the true intent was not to keep the shoe forever, but to initiate a ransom demand. The thief, or a spokesperson for the group, would then publicly declare their possession of the shoe and state their terms for its return. The demands were rarely exorbitant, often consisting of a sum of money, a round of drinks for the groomsmen, or some other minor concession from the groom. The specific currency, whether silver coins, copper pence, or even a promise of future favors, would be stated clearly. The negotiation process would then begin. The groom, now involved in the playful ritual, would have to engage with the thieves to reclaim his bride's missing footwear. This often involved mock haggling, exaggerated pleas, or even humorous threats. The groom might feign exasperation, rolling his eyes or throwing his hands up in mock defeat, all while knowing that he would ultimately comply. The onlookers, particularly the younger guests, would cheer and laugh, delighting in the spectacle. The groom might reach into his purse or signal to a servant for a tray of ale, making a public show of fulfilling the ransom request. Upon receiving the agreed-upon ransom, the shoe would be ceremoniously returned to the bride. The thief might bow dramatically, or present the shoe on a cushion as if returning a royal relic. The bride would then, often with a smile, slip her foot back into the shoe, signaling the completion of the ritual. This act would often be met with applause and further laughter from the guests as the minor disruption concluded and the feast resumed its previous jovial atmosphere. The whole event was a light-hearted interlude, a way to break up the formality of the wedding feast and inject some fun and interaction. The symbolism attributed to the shoe, even if unspoken, was often related to fertility, luck, or the transfer of authority. The foot, and by extension, the shoe, was sometimes linked to fertility in folk beliefs. The act of stealing and reclaiming could be seen as a symbolic act of taking possession or asserting authority within the new union. Playful nature of the event belied any deeper meaning, making it more of a fun tradition than a solemn ritual. The joy and amusement surrounding the act were palpable, as the guests relished the temporary disruption and the theatricality of the negotiation. The specific moment it was taken, the slight disruption it caused as the bride noticed its absence, the playful chase that might briefly ensue, the public demand for payment, the groom's good-natured reaction, and finally, the seamless return of the shoe and the bride putting it back on, all contributed to a well-rehearsed and delightful performance. The chatter around the tables would turn to the antics of the shoe thieves, with guests recounting previous instances or debating the cleverness of the current heist. It was a moment of collective participation, where the entire community was drawn into the playful spirit of the wedding celebrations. Number 3. The binding of hands, hand fasting. In many parts of medieval Europe, particularly in regions with strong customary law or where access to formal religious ceremonies was limited, a practice known as hand fasting served as a significant, often binding form of marriage. This ritual was not merely symbolic, it was the literal act of joining the couple's hands together, marking their commitment to one another in a public declaration. tangible aspect of the binding was central to its power and recognition. The materials used for the binding were simple yet meaningful. Ribbons, often brightly colored, or cords made from woven natural fibers, like flax or wool, were common. Sometimes, strips of fabric, perhaps torn from a family garment, were utilized. The choice of material often carried regional or familial significance, though no specific meaning was universally ascribed. Cord or ribbon would be long enough to wrap multiple times around the clasped hands of the couple. The texture of the material, whether smooth silk or coarse wool, added a sensory element to the physical act. The act itself was straightforward. The couple would stand facing each other, often outdoors, in a public space such as a village green, a crossroads, or by a standing stone. Though it could also occur in a home. They would clasp their right hands, or sometimes both hands, palm to palm. Then, a third person would step forward to perform the binding. This individual could be a priest, lending a religious sanction to the union, or a respected community elder, a local magistrate, or even a parent. In some cases, the couple might even bind their own hands, each wrapping a portion of the cord around their clasped hands. The chosen binder would then carefully, and often deliberately, wrap the chosen ribbon or cord around their clasped hands multiple times. The wrapping would be firm enough to signify a strong bond, but not so tight as to cause discomfort. As the hands were bound, words were spoken. These were typically declarations of intent and commitment. A couple would often declare their intention to marry or to live together as husband and wife. The binder might recite a blessing or a formal declaration of the union, stating that by this act they were joined. The specific words varied greatly by region and custom, but their essence was always a public affirmation of the couple's mutual agreement to be wed. The sound of their voices, clear and strong, would carry across the space, confirming their intentions to all present. One of the most intriguing aspects of hand fasting was its variable duration. While some hand fastings were intended as permanent, lifelong unions, others were explicitly temporary. These temporary hand fastings might be for a year and a day, at the end of which the couple could decide to formalize their union through a church wedding or to separate without stigma. This temporary nature allowed for a period of trial, a chance for the couple to ascertain their compatibility before committing to a permanent bond. The very concept of a temporary marriage sanctioned by custom was a stark contrast to later, more rigid ecclesiastical laws. The specific knots tied during the binding were sometimes significant. A simple knot might indicate a temporary bond, while a more complex, intricate knot could signify a lifelong commitment. The dexterity of the binder in creating these knots was often observed. The physical sensation of the hands being bound together was immediate and tangible. The couple would feel the pressure of the cord, the warmth of their clasped hands, and the symbolic weight of the commitment. The binding was not merely a visual spectacle, it was a physical manifestation of their union. Witnesses were almost always present, as the public nature of the declaration was crucial for its validity. Presence of these witnesses meant that the community formally acknowledged and recognized the union, providing it with legal and social standing. The breaking of the bond, in the case of temporary hand fastings, was also a ritualized process, often involving the unwrapping of the cord by the original binder, signifying the dissolution of the temporary union. The place where the hand fasting occurred was often outdoors, drawing on ancient traditions of public assembly and natural sacred spaces. The open air, the sunlight filtering through leaves, or the distant sounds of nature provided a backdrop to the solemn yet deeply personal ritual. The specific colors of the ribbons, perhaps chosen for their symbolic meanings or simply for their availability, would be noted by the attendees. The way the hands were positioned, perhaps with fingers intertwined, added to the visual representation of their unity. The slow, deliberate movements of the binder as they wrapped the the quiet hum of anticipation from the onlookers, and the final sight of the bound hands were all integral parts of this ancient and powerful tradition. It was a clear, unambiguous signal to the community that a new marital unit had been formed, whether for a specified period or for life. Number 2. The obstacle course to the church. The bridal procession in medieval Europe was far from a simple walk down an aisle. It was a grand public journey, often transformed into a kind of celebratory obstacle course that wound its way from the bride's family home to the church. This journey was rich with symbolism, interactions, and sometimes deliberate interruptions, turning the pathway into an extension of the wedding ceremony itself. Every step, every encounter was observed and contributed to the spectacle. The procession would begin at the bride's family residence, where she would make her formal farewells. Dressed in her finest attire, often new garments representing her fresh start, she would emerge, usually escorted by her father or a senior male relative, symbolizing the transfer of her care. Her female attendants, often young women from her family or friends, would follow closely, sometimes carrying her train or baskets of flowers. The groom, typically awaiting at a short distance, or meeting her along the route, would be accompanied by his own retinue of groomsmen and male family members. The sounds of musicians, playing pipes, drums, and lutes, would often lead the procession, their lively tunes announcing the event to the entire village or town. The route itself was not merely a pathway, but a stage. As the procession moved through the streets, villagers and townspeople would gather, lining the roads, eager to witness the event. This public display ensured that the community bore witness to the union. The air might be filled with the scent of herbs or flowers, as attendants often carried bouquets or scattered fragrant leaves along the path, perhaps to ward off evil, or simply to purify the way. The specific clothing worn by each participant was carefully chosen, the bride in her best, the groom in fine tunics, the attendants in their ceremonial garments, creating a vibrant visual tapestry, moving through the environment. One of the most intriguing aspects of this journey was the potential for obstacles or challenges along the way. These were not always malicious. They could be traditional elements designed to test the couple, extract gifts, or simply add to the festive chaos. Villagers might symbolically block the path, demanding small payments or gifts from the groom to allow the procession to pass. This could be a playful exchange, with laughter and good-natured haggling. Sometimes local folk would perform specific traditional dances or sing short songs at certain points along the route, expecting a small token of appreciation or a drink from the wedding party. The sounds of their voices, sometimes off-key but enthusiastic, would mingle with the official music of the procession. The throwing of grains, such as wheat or oats or sometimes rice, was a common practice. These grains, symbols of fertility and abundance, were scattered over the couple as they passed, a communal blessing for a fruitful marriage. Old shoes, too, were sometimes thrown, a curious custom that might have signified good luck or the warding off of evil. The rhythmic thud of the shoes tossed by onlookers would briefly punctuate the music and shouts. The noise from the crowd, a mix of well wishes, playful shouts, and the occasional jest, added to the lively atmosphere. The specific attire of each person, from the elaborate headdress of the bride to the humble attire of the onlookers, contributed to the visual detail of the scene. At thresholds or crossroads, specific rituals might be performed. The bride might pause, offering a silent prayer or a blessing. In some regions, she might step over a particular object, like a broom or a piece of turf, symbolizing a break from her old life and an embrace of the new. The slow march of the procession, dictated by the solemnity of the occasion and the frequent pauses for interaction, built a sense of anticipation among the onlookers. Public nature of the entire event, where nearly every resident witnessed the journey, meant that the wedding was undeniably a community affair, sanctioned and celebrated by all. The journey to the church was not just a means to an end. It was a significant ritual in itself, full of observable actions, sounds, and interactions that publicly transformed the bride's status and integrated her into her new family and community. The scent of wood smoke from hearths, mixed with the perfume of flowers and the damp earth underfoot, would create a sensory experience for all involved. Each person in the procession had a defined role, contributing to the slow, deliberate movement towards the final destination. The sunlight, perhaps dappled through trees or shining brightly on an open street, illuminated the scene, making every detail visible. Number 1. The public bedding ceremony. For many medieval couples, the wedding day did not conclude with the church ceremony or the grand feast. It often culminated in a highly public and ritualized bedding ceremony, where the newly married pair were formally put to bed by their families and friends. This was far from a private affair. It was a communal rite, rich in observable actions and solemn blessings, and it served as the final official sealing of the marriage in the eyes of the community. Procession of the couple to the bedchamber was itself a significant event. After the feast had wound down, the bride and groom would be escorted, often by a large retinue of female relatives for the bride and male friends for the groom, to the designated bedchamber. The attendees were not merely bystanders. They were active participants, witnesses to this final stage of the marriage rituals. The sounds of their footsteps, the rustle of their garments, and their hushed voices would fill the corridors as they made their way to the room. Once in the bedchamber, specific rituals of dressing or undressing would unfold. Female attendants would help the bride prepare for bed, removing her outer garments, perhaps her elaborate headdress and jewelry, and assisting her into a simpler nightgown. Simultaneously, male friends or attendants would help the groom, often removing his ceremonial attire. These actions were not performed in secret. They were observed by the assembled witnesses. The specific fabrics of their nightclothes, whether simple linen or finer silk, would be visible. Careful folding of garments, the slow unlacing of bodices, all contributed to the ritualistic pace. The bed itself was central to the ceremony. It was often formally blessed, sometimes by a priest who might offer prayers over the marital bed, or by an elder family member who would sprinkle holy water or make a sign of the cross. This blessing imbued the bed with sacred significance, ensuring fertility and a blessed union. Candles would flicker around the room, casting a soft, intimate glow upon the scene, highlighting the solemnity of the moment. The hangings of the bed, often embroidered and rich in color, would frame the central stage of the event. The act of the couple getting into bed was performed under the watchful eyes of the witnesses. They would climb into the bed, often one after the other, not necessarily naked, but in their nightclothes. This was a public act of formalizing their union, not a private one. Presence of multiple people in the room, watching the couple prepare for bed, emphasized the communal nature of the event. They were not there to witness intimacy, but to witness the formal establishment of the married state. After the couple was settled in bed, the curtains of the bed might be formally drawn, or the witnesses would withdraw from the room, leaving the couple alone. Before leaving, many would offer public good wishes, blessings for fertility, and prayers for a long and happy life together. These good wishes were often spoken loudly enough to be heard by the couple, emphasizing the communal support for their union. The specific gestures of the departing guests, a final nod, a whispered prayer, added to the atmosphere of a completed ritual. Sometimes, a nightcap drink, often spiced wine or ale, would be offered to the couple before the witnesses departed, a final gesture of hospitality and comfort. The specific items in the room, from the carved bed frame to the candles casting their light, all contributed to the atmosphere of this important moment. The role of the bedder, or chamberlain, the individual explicitly tasked with overseeing this ritual, was a formal position, underscoring the structured nature of the event. This public bedding ceremony was a deliberate, formal act, a final communal affirmation of the new marital unit, and a ritualized conclusion to the entire wedding process, marking the definitive transition of the couple into their new shared life. The hushed voices of the attendees, the soft rustle of fabrics, and a soft glow of the candlelight all contributed to the solemn, yet public, atmosphere.